Right then, today we're going to do the rear wheel bearings for this spoke wheel. Let's pretend everything's in one piece at the moment. Normally you'd see that arrangement with that little cover held on with these Allen screw bolts. So you take all those out. That allows you to take that cover off, little paper gasket with it, and that obviously has the seal there to seal all the bearings in place. Now the bearing stack, as it's called, is this paraphernalia here. So you've got the top hats at both ends, another one there with the bearings, and then a main outer tube or spacer, and then you've got the inner spacer, and I think you can probably just see it there with what's called the wedding band or a shim. Okay, now that lot is all in there like that, and it's held in place with an interference fit between the bearing outer shells and these positions inside the hub. So to get this out, you have to heat this hub up. It's aluminium, so you heat it up to about 100 degrees. Get a hammer, and you can tap on this wheel spindle from the other side, and all this lot will come out. What I do is put this facing horizontally on some blocks of wood spaced around the wheel, and then make sure the blocks of wood are high enough so this can tap out, and then gently tap it through. Make sure that when it's coming through that this one doesn't gouge on that surface there, so you want to keep it square as it comes through, tapping gently and checking that it's coming out square, and that way you'll get the whole bearing stack out, with the old bearings probably looking quite manky compared to this, and then we can check the preload of the bearings with the new ones when we put them in. Okay, so to check the preload, we've got to rebuild the stack as it appeared when we took it out of the wheel. So the first thing that goes on is the small top hat, followed by, this is a brand new wheel bearing, so the old ones have gone in the bin, and then you've got the internal tube with the position there for the what they call the wedding band in America. We'd call it a shim. So the shim goes in there, and now this is the shim that was in there when I took it apart. And then after that you want the outer spacer, and then your next wheel bearing, and then the other top hat, the big one. So that's your stack. Now we've got to preload it, so what we have to do then is I rig up a tube using a couple of those, and then these are some spare wheel shims, and you've got to get it high enough so that you can put the nut on and tighten that lot down. You've got to torque it down the same as you would torque it when it's on the bike. So it's not very high torque, it's about 40 Newton meters. So far that's just hand tight, and you can already see that is already tight, and I can barely move that, and that's just finger tight. If I pull that down with a spanner to any kind of tension, you can see that is completely immovable. The bearings are almost, they're moving, but they're almost solid. So the preload on that is not right, it's too tight, and those bearings will more than likely burn out really quickly in use. So what I've got to do is I've got to change that shim for another one. So I've got to figure out what size shim to put in this position here. So that shim there has got to go, and we've got to figure out a way of changing that to make the preload correct. Okay, to decide what shim we're going to change to, what I'm going to do is mic the shim that came out of it, and we'll find out what thickness it is. And putting the mic on that and reading that off, that reads to me 6.5, 6.91. So that's 6.91. So we want something a bit thicker than that. Now I've got a bunch of shims here, but they're all way too big. So they're all, by eye, they're going to be much too big. Now I had this one as well, and it was a little bit bigger than the original one. So let's mic it. to see how big this one is in comparison. And this one is bang on 7. So 6.9, 7. Okay, now what I did with this one, because it was a little bit bigger than 7 actually, if you look at that surface there, you can see it's being rubbed down compared to the original face. And this one was nearly 7.1. So what I did to get it to the right thickness was use some wet and dry paper, and this is 400 grit, and a piece of glass so it's nice and flat, and I just wound that down, did it a few times, checked it, did it a few times, checked it, and when I say checked it, what I mean is I rebuilt the stack and checked for the amount of play or preload, and now I reckon that's correct. Now I'll show you, and this is according to the Illinois BMW riders, this is how he checks for the preload, and I'll go through it now. Right then, let's rebuild this stack with this new shim in, the 7mm shim, and let's see what it looks like from the point of view of preload. So top hat, wheel bearing, and then we've got the inner spacer with the 7mm, and there's the outer tube, and the next wheel bearing, and then your top hat. So that's what you got inside your wheel, and then obviously your forks are either side. So to make up that space so we can get some preload on it, we've got to improvise a tube, and then we can put the nut back on top. Okay, we can wind that down. Before we pull it down with the spanner, we'll just line everything up as it would be in the wheel. At the moment it spins freely and that moves quite easily. So we'll give it a tweak like we would when it's on the bike. It's 40 Newton meters. I'm just going to guess it. Feels about right. So you can see that the bearings spin okay. So that spins easy enough. Now the Illinois riders, the way he checks for the preload is, what he says is if you can move that with just a finger by pushing, then it's too loose. But if you get your two thumbs and you have to apply moderate pressure to this central tube, and you can move it backwards and forwards with moderate pressure, then your preload is about right, because you don't want this too tight and you don't want it too slack. If it's too tight, if the bearings are too tight, and they're going to run hot and they're going to burn out, and possibly, if you're really unlucky, they'll gouge the wheel hub, because it's aluminium. They'll overheat the aluminium hub, and this will spin in the wheel hub and it'll wreck the wheel hub, and that'll be the end of that. So you don't want it too tight, and you don't want it too slack, or else your wheel will have a bit of wobble and your handling will be pretty awful. So you want it just there, so moderate pressure on your thumbs, and that would look about right. So we've just done a slight shim change. It was only 0.1 of a mil to make that right, but obviously the old bearings had worn, and they might have been a different different make or whatever. They're all, I guess, slightly different. So every time you change your bearings, you want to check for the preload. Now this can all go back into the wheel as it is. So what I'm going to do, put this in a plastic bag. Firstly I'm going to fill these with grease, and then I'll put this in a plastic bag, put it in the freezer so it cools it all down, shrinks it all down slightly, and then I'll set the wheel up again on the blocks of wood. I'll heat the hub again up to about 100, and then we'll be able to drop this in place and tap it through, and these positions here will grip inside the hub, and it'll be ready to go. So we've done the preload, and now we've just got to rebuild the wheel. Okay, I heated up the wheel hub with a hairdryer, put it on max, heated up the hub nice and hot. This has been in the freezer for about an hour in a plastic bag. All the bearings are all greased up and ready to go in. And then I just brought this in, having put the hairdryer out of the way, dropped it in. It went straight through the first point, so the first bearing seat, and then a couple of taps, gentle taps on the top there, just to get it to seat down at the bottom. So now we can let that cool down. The bearings will then grip in their positions, and then we can do all this lot, take it off, and then we can refit the little cap, the little cover with a paper gasket, and it's ready to go back in the bike.